Rascal Does Not Dream of Bunny Girl Senpai is a supernatural romantic comedy produced by Studio Cloverworks in 2018. Same production company famous for adapting great romances of our age, like Darling in the Franxx. Okay, yeah, on second thought, maybe that wasn't the best way to introduce this. Lasting for 13 episodes and one film that Aniplex might never release outside of that one limited showing in theaters. No, I'm not bitter. Bunny Girl Senpai is a series that makes entertainment out of mediocrity. It covers a variety of tales about a variety of characters with a supernatural twist to make it interesting. You might say that you've heard that description before, and well, you'd be right, because actually that could apply to a bunch of shows. But my goal here, as the series does, is to attempt to showcase the uniqueness and the charm of Bunny Girl Senpai. So that's what I'm going to do. Ladies, gentlemen, and others, my name is Okada, and today, on Glass Reflection, we are looking at Rascal Does Not Dream of Bunny Girl Senpai. Let's jam. Bunny Girl Senpai follows the story of Sakuta, a very typical and somewhat boring high school student who just so happens to have a bit of history with supernatural elements that rational people think are insane. His sister lost her memory after experiencing episodes that caused wounds to appear on her body out of nowhere. And he himself got a gash across his chest with no explanation as to where it came from. So you'd think that he wouldn't bat an eye at more surprising things happening in his life. Which is true, until one of those things happens to be the appearance of his senpai, waltzing around in a bunny girl outfit. Ignoring the show's title because it holds little relevance outside of the initial arc, the series continues to follow Sakuta as he continually comes into contact with a phenomena that the show calls Adolescence syndrome, and also the girls who suffer from it. Adolescence syndrome is when abnormal things happen to people during puberty that traditional science can't explain, and most people don't acknowledge. The series doesn't just treat it like some supernatural handwave though, but rather as a phenomena that greatly affects the atmosphere of the world around you. The idea of this atmosphere is not the scientific atmosphere that surrounds the Earth, which allows us to breathe, but a more social atmosphere, and it's something that allows communication to proceed in natural ways. There's actually a phrase for this in Japanese, kukiyomanai, or can't read the air. In any social situation, if you can read the room, then you can adapt to the situation easily. If you can't though, you might end up making things awkward by rocking the boat. And this whole concept drives much of the show's plot. Early on in the initial arcs, the show focuses on interacting with this atmosphere and reading the room from a more subtle angle. In the first arc, Mai finds herself unable to be seen by more and more people as time goes on. This is because as a popular actress, her life is very public. She is seen by everyone, and subconsciously, she wants to be left alone, to be invisible. So the show's Adolescence syndrome makes that a reality. It changes the atmosphere so that now interacting with her is almost like a taboo, so no one does. They're not being malicious, they don't even realize it. They are just following the atmosphere. How the resolution of every arc works is just a matter of realizing what exactly caused the atmosphere to be changed in the first place, and then to either reverse it or come to understand the greater problem. With Koga, time keeps repeating itself, causing her and Sakuta to relive the same days over and over again in hopes of finding a happy ending. Futaba ends up with a doppelganger, one who is far more risque and bold with her choices, and the two conflict with who is the genuine article. Toyohama and her half-sister switch bodies and lives as pressure begins to mount in her life for not being as successful as her sister is. Even Sakuta's sister Kaede suffers, as she was the victim from bullying from her classmates that the atmosphere unfortunately turned into actual physical wounds. Her only recourse was to shut down socially and become somewhat of a recluse, unable to leave the apartment without suffering massive panic attacks. It's Sakuta's job to basically figure out the problems with all of his friends and make the atmosphere revert back to how it was, allowing the adolescence syndrome to pass. He can do this because he himself is socially awkward. He can't read the room, so it's much harder for the atmosphere to affect him. That's a polite way of saying that he can be a bit of a dick, and the story came up with a way to show that that's a positive thing. To be fair, this makes the show a tough sell. You could watch the first episode of the series, realize that with every new arc, you're gonna have this almost generic guy just fall into the lives of these attractive women who need help that only he can provide, and roll your eyes back so hard you break your own neck from the contortion. And to an extent, that is still a problem. The trait of harem protagonist X has been a mainstay in many anime for years, but while the writers offer little more than a shrug as they dump Sakuta into this situation, I still feel like he as a character makes the best of it more than most. Many times characters in this situation are either excessively dense, impulsive, or both. But when you're dealing with scenarios that the writers like to attempt to explain in scientific fashions, through Futaba in this case, Sakuta needed to be at least halfway intelligent to understand what is going on, and empathetic enough to actually want to help those he runs across without bleeding too much into just loving or lusting after his charges. With the exception of Mai, of course. Sakuta's greatest asset is as a builder, not a solver. It's easy to say that he is the one that comes into the lives of these girls and solves all of their problems, but he can't solve the problems. What he can do is help to identify them so that they can solve the problem themselves. Well, doesn't that sound familiar? Where have I heard that before? So, this all ties into what could be Bunny Girl Senpai's biggest problem. Let's take a step back for a moment and run a quick comparison. I'm sure you all know it. So let's see how this show compares to that of another anime of the same genre. And I'm of course talking about The World God Only Knows. What else could I be talking about? Both protagonists have roughly the same goal. Both are charged with saving the lives of girls who are afflicted by an outside supernatural influence beyond their control. But since their situations are very similar, I wanted to bring up one interesting fact. Who talks about God Only Knows anymore? After completing a variety of story arcs, the anime hasn't seen a resurgence in public consciousness since the airing of its final arc in 2013. It was an enjoyable experience, sure, I even recommended it back when it aired, but eventually, people forgot about it. Why is that? My take? Because while both shows are entertaining, the biggest problem is that it's possible for one to look at them and only see the stories that came before, which doesn't make the memory of them last very long. Unless the stories do better. This brings us back to Bunny Girl Senpai, because Mai's arc is like Fuko Ikubi from Clannad. Koga is Haruhi from Endless 8, and heck, the amount of people who have drawn comparisons to Monogatari and Snafu might have a point, even if those comparisons are far more negative than I think the show deserves. Like, I bet almost everyone who has watched Haruhi and then saw Bunny Girl Senpai's second arc about Koga and her problem with repeating time then thought, Endless 8? The premises of both are identical at the start, hence the comparison, but thankfully their resolutions are completely different. And that's the point. I learned things about Laplace's demon that Haruhi never talked about, and hey, it didn't suck my life away by making me watch the same episode 8 freaking times! This is what I mean by changing the stories for the better. It's in the changes that make it more interesting. There are some people that try to claim that Monogatari is an original story, when it itself leans heavily on tales of folklore from Japan and other cultures, but most people don't care about that because of the way that Monogatari adapts its stories to be better, or at least as entertaining as those that came before. It's not that it's similar that's the important part, or to be taken as a negative, but rather that it differs. If done well, this then makes it a positive, which is something I believe Bunny Girl Senpai succeeded with. But while I may enjoy these unique factors a lot, it also matters whether or not the anime community as a whole does too. This brings us back briefly to God Only Knows, an example of a series that, while entertaining, faded from public consciousness for not being unique enough to stand the test of time. This is a possible future that Bunny Girl Senpai faces. If its legacy is a constant comparison to other shows, it'll find it hard to stand out, and its success or failure relies on how similar the viewer found it to other work, and if they view that to be a positive or not. Personally, I view it as a show that does stand on its own 2 feet. I know it to be a series capable of standing outside of the shadow of others because, being perfectly honest, half the comparisons that I mentioned in this video didn't even come to mind when I watched the show. It wasn't until afterwards, while writing this video, that most of those similarities started to jump out in my mind. While I don't want to completely disregard the similarities between Bunny Girl Senpai and other stories, I do believe that these comparisons are the shackles of the show. If you don't see them, if you don't know the other shows, if Rascal is the first story of its kind that you've come across, then that shackle just disappears, and the things that make Rascal unique will be an added bonus to the overall story. Many people can easily draw other comparisons between, like, Bunny Girl Senpai and The Melancholy of Haruhi Suzumiya, as while the reasoning behind events in the shows are different, the results are very similar. Both Sakuta and Kyon find themselves having to deal with a variety of supernatural situations revolving around the characters of the show, and using their logical ability and endless amounts of snark, they eventually solve the issues that plague the world. But it's also been almost 10 years since the last mainline Haruhi entry, and that archetype that Kyon filled needed to be updated. Some would say it has been with Monogatari's Araragi, but I felt like that went a bit too far in the wrong direction. Sakuta doesn't purposefully shoot lewd eyes at every female character for the chance at a panty shot. He does make inappropriate comments, sure, but never in a tone that comes off as demeaning. Like in the case of interacting with Mai, most of his comments are carefully crafted to help her overcome her self-consciousness that might cause her to relapse. He's not perfect, and neither is the show. There are plenty of times that Sakuta comes off far more as your everyday boring protagonist, and his moments of individuality don't happen as often as I would have liked. But I will say that I actively looked forward to more episodes of this series as I watched it. I was delighted when I had a chance to watch the film, and I was sad when it was all over, which is not something that happens to me very often with shows of this genre. On the surface, Bunny Girl Senpai seems like your run-of-the-mill supernatural harem narrative that you might have witnessed more often than you might have liked. And while I won't say that those elements don't exist, because they do, the show never fully leans into them. It's that difference that sets it apart from others in the same vein and makes the series feel like a breath of fresh air. If you're still on the fence, I'd say to just watch the first 3 episodes of the show. Those cover the show's first arc and are basically great as a standalone film on its own. Beyond that, only continue if you like what you see, but as far as I'm concerned, after meticulously calculating my thoughts on the categories of story, characters, animation, sound, and my own personal enjoyment, which, after constantly altering the flow of time until I was happy with my thoughts on it, has me awarding Rascal Does Not Dream of Bunny Girl Senpai with the rating to buy it. And you can! Now, the Blu-ray release is an Aniplex release, but it's only 2/3 of the cost of Bakemonogatari. As I said yesterday, they've learned a little bit when it comes to their pricing in North America, but it's still quite high. However, I think that it's worth it just to have the series on your shelf. If you don't want to go that far though, it's also available for streaming on both Crunchyroll and Funimation. So that's a good secondary option if finances are a little tight this Christmas season, because that's not gonna date this video at all. As far as alternate anime recommendations, I would start with a dear classic of mine and go with Clannad and Clannad After Story. It's now over 10 years old, but it's still got it. It has a similar situation with a protagonist who has to deal with supernatural elements and the girls that they revolve around. But if you want all of that, and also one with more bunny girls, then my second recommendation goes to The Melancholy of Haruhi Suzumiya. It's another favorite that doesn't revolve as heavily around multiple female characters, but is a classic in its own right. And between these two, you should hopefully find something to your liking. Lastly, I want to give a very special thank you to my patrons who not only support my work in general, but who also allow me to do what I do. I love and appreciate you all. Specifically though, as I like to do, I want to give particular shout outs to patrons Rune Jacobson, Calhoun Boy, Richard Emile Bradley, Hector Montemayor, Sidi Yamako, and Ryfan Bonaparte for being especially awesome. You guys are great. And until next time, ladies, gentlemen, and others, watch more anime and stay frosty.